Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Noshin, and I am the Projects and Events Coordinator for the Qur'anic Studies Unit, which is part of the Department of Academic Research and Publications here at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the official book launch of an anthology of Qur'anic commentaries, Volume 2, on women, which is edited by Karen Bauer and Faraz Hamza, who are here with us today. A special welcome to those of you who are joining us online through our live webcast. As many of you know, this has been the first in-person event that we have had the pleasure of organising in almost 2 years. And so it is incredible to see so many of you in the room and so many of you who have joined online. I think we've got numbers in the region of around 400, so no pressure, guys. There's quite a lot of people who are joining. The lecture will last approximately an hour and a half, and will be followed by a drinks reception in the atrium just outside. There will be an opportunity for questions to be asked towards the end of the event. For those of you joining online, please submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please also ensure that you include your name, institution, and the country you are based in. This is always very nice for us to know when we are answering questions. A couple of housekeeping rules before we begin, if I may. We are not planning on having a fire drill tonight, so if the alarm does sound, please make your way through one of the exits to my left and to my right, and make your way down the stairs and out of the building. Please also take a moment now to just ensure that your mobile phones are on silent. I see many of you doing that now, which is great. So whilst this is an official launch of the Anthology Volume 2, we are unable to sell copies of the publication tonight. This is almost like a pre-launch until we wait for bulk copies to arrive. However, you'll notice on your seats that there is a beautifully crafted leaflet with a wonderful discount code, which will provide you with a special 30% discount if you were to use the voucher through the OUP website. So it's quite a substantial discount. We've also provided a few copies of the publication, which is on the desk on my right, for you guys to skim through, have a look, and see if it's something that is of interest to you. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Omar Alidian-Zaga, who is the Academic Coordinator for the Qur'anic Studies Unit and the Series Editor for the Qur'anic Studies Series, which is published in association with Oxford University Press. Omar will be introducing our speakers for this evening and will also moderate the question and answer session towards the end. Please join me in welcoming Omar.
Good evening and welcome. Dr. Farhad Daftari, Director of the Institute of Ismaili Studies, guest panelists, colleagues, students and friends. Let me begin this event with what Immanuel Kant called the holy duty of gratitude. Firstly, thank you to Drs. Karen Bauer and Faraz Hamza for showering us with the fruits of your arduous labors, for presenting us with the gift of your scholarship, for bequeathing to us and to the next generations your generous and learned legacy. All these years and years have now resulted in a monumental contribution to scholarship. Thank you for the volume on women of an anthology of Qur'anic commentaries. A big thank you also to Dr. Daftari for your constant support, which often took the form of, and for the sake of the audience, you must imagine this in a kind yet very emphatic manner. Your encouragement, as I'm saying, often took the form of, but just when is the next volume of the anthology going to come out? Well, it is now with us. Without your encouragement, it would not have become a reality. Thank you. A large project like this calls for a large editorial and logistical endeavor. So thank you to all those who have contributed to the production of this book. Finally, a word of thanks to our publishing partners, Oxford University Press, in association with whom the IIS publishes the Quranic Studies series. Now, I will make some short remarks, and then I will introduce today's panelists. The idea of producing an anthology of Quranic commentaries was developed in conversations between the then director of the IIS years ago, Professor Azim Nanji, and other scholars and institutions, notably Harvard. To make a long story short, the idea was to select a handful of verses from the Quran, around 5 or 6, and to choose a large number of commentators, around 20 or so. A unit, the Quranic Studies unit, was formed at the IIS under the leading aegis of Dr. Shainul Jiva, who is also with us today. The spirit that guided the project was a pluralistic one. If Islam is not a monolith, then surely the interpretations of the Quran were various, diverse, and different, and at times contradictory, thus putting the texts on the table, so to speak, and juxtapose them, became an exercise of what we might call scholarly pluralism. My main remark tonight regards the issue of translating. It is absolutely lamentable that a field like Islamic studies, which is so dependent on texts sometimes, has moved away from rewarding the intellectual and academic effort that is involved in translation. And in doing so, this field is following the trend of so many academic frameworks and review mechanisms that ignore translations as secondary and unimportant contributions, while sometimes overvaluing often what can be described as poor monographs. Translating is not only translating. To translate a text is also contextualizing it, explaining it, explicating it, as our colleagues like to translate tafsir, explication. To explain a text, you must understand it. And in doing all of the above, you must be able to present the translation so that it can be used as teaching material and as an object of research. So the Anthology of Quranic Commentaries is an attempt to show, through translations, the diversity of the Muslim scriptural commentarial traditions, in the plural. We published the first volume on the nature of the divine, which I also have here, some years ago. The volume that occupies us today on women is the second volume in the series, and we have plans for future volumes on a number of themes. But I will let Drs. Bauer and Hamza speak about this volume, the volume on women. Now, as for our panelists, we are accompanied by 4 scholars, apart from Drs. Bauer and Hamza. So I will present them one by one. Yasmin Amin, who is joining us online from Egypt. Hello, Yasmin. Yes. She has edited the book Islamic Interpretive Traditions and Gender Justice, Processes of Canonization, Subversion and Change. And she's the co-editor of Comedy and Humor in the Muslim World, Contemporary Islamic Context, together with Bernard Schweitzer, Lina Molokotos-Liederman, and herself, yes, of course. She has also translated. You will see that this is a common thread, that there is translation, seems to be linking many of the things that our scholars are doing. She has also translated, along with Nesreen Amin, Hussein Amin's Sorrowful Muslim's Guide, or Dalil al-Muslim al-Hazin, which was published by our sister institution, the Aga Khan University's Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations. Yasmin has numerous articles on a number of topics, ranging from Salama to Ijtihad. Her dissertation on humor and laughter in the Hadith was awarded from Exeter University in July 2021. So congratulations for that. Yes, people are clapping. We are also joined by Walid Saleh, from also online from Toronto, Canada. He is a professor at the University of Toronto, He is one of the foremost scholar on tafsir in North America and perhaps all Western context, but perhaps also globally, who knows? He has dozens of articles on the Quran and tafsir, but also interested in the wonderful world of paleography and manuscripts, among many other things. He's the recipient of numerous academic awards. He's the author of The Formation of the Classical Tafsir Tradition, which was a first monograph study on Al-Thalabi and his influence in the study of Quran commentary. His second monograph was In Defense of the Bible, which was a detailed study and edition of Al-Biqai's Bible treatise on the permissibility of quoting from the old scriptures. Walid Saleh is also the editor of the Routledge Quran series, somehow of a rival to the Quranic study series, but anyway. No, this is just a joke. He is also on the editorial board of a number of journals, among which the Journal of the American Academy of Religion and the Journal of Quranic Studies. So welcome, Walid, there. Okay, I'll finish soon, I promise. We have Anna Chrysostomides, I hope I'm pronouncing it well, who has received her DPhil from Oxford University in 2018 and specializes in conversion and Islamization in the early Islamic period. She has articles on the use of icons, Christian attendance at Muslim festivals, religious code switching in the 8th to the 10th centuries. Her book on the Islamization of the medieval Near East is forthcoming. And finally, we have Sarah Savant, who is professor at the Aga Khan University's Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations. I've learned this by heart by now. It's really, AKU's AISMC for short. She's a cultural historian specializing in the Middle East and Iran around the years 600 to 1100. She's the author of The New Muslims of Post-Conquest Iran, Tradition, Memory and Conversion. She has translated, together with Peter Webb, Ibn Qutayba's Fadl al-Arab as The Excellence of the Arabs for the prestigious Library of Arabic Literature. She has produced numerous articles and edited volumes dealing with ethnic identity, cultural memory, genealogy, history writing, book history, etc. She's also the head of the Kitab project, which is developing digital methods to study the origins and development of the Arabic and Persian textual traditions, a very large project funded by the European Research Council, the Qatar National Library, the British Academy, the Mellon Foundation, and the Aga Khan University. So, quite a mouthful there. Welcome to all, and now I give the floor to Drs. Karen Bauer and Firas Hamza so that they can talk to us about their work and start the discussion.
Thank you.
All right. So I'd like to thank you all for coming here, everybody who's here in person, everybody who's online, and especially our guests and who've agreed to speak tonight. And Omar mentioned some of the editorial team, and I just wanted to specifically thank our main copy editor, Lisa. I wanted to thank Tara, who oversaw all of the editing, Russell, and Eleanor, who all played a part in editing this project. I wanted to also thank Notion, who has been with us the whole time. And there is a whole team that put this event together that we'd also like to thank. Sushil and Rehana especially, and our events team with Mafe Joseph and Chilla. Okay, I think that I've got that right, potentially. But yes, and so thank you all for putting together this lovely event, and we really appreciate it. And I also wanted to thank Omar, not only for being here tonight, even though he's he's had some health issues recently. But our real expression of gratitude to Omar tonight is his recognition that intellectual diversity is a good thing in the field of Quranic studies, which is a vision he's had for the Quranic studies book series, and it's really obvious in the books in the book series. And it's a vision that brought us together as editors, that this diversity can actually work well. Yeah, and so for that we really thank you. Yeah, and so should I just say a word about my journey from the monograph, or do you want to say something first?
I think having been in the field for that long, I think it's probably
so
wise that you kick us off with your thoughts about that journey, probably. Studying gender and looking at tafsir text.
Yeah. So some of you know that I wrote a monograph that had to do with some of the translations that are present in this book, and that came out in 2015. And so I, of course, thought it would be really no problem and it would be quite straightforward and easy to produce translations of some of those texts that I'd already translated for myself when I was writing my monograph. And how wrong I was. So I can just only say that writing a book like this is in some ways so much more complex, actually, than writing a monograph, because in a monograph, of course, you're using your text to make your argument, but in a work like this, the task is to bring out the voices of others, to translate them fairly and accurately, even when you may vehemently disagree with what they're saying, and then to frame it with introductions, not only to make it accessible and comprehensible for anybody who may hope to read it, even though it's sometimes very nearly inaccessible to anyone, even in the Arabic, but also to frame it in a way that makes it more comprehensible by including, of course, introductory materials. We've really tried to do that here, to show the textual tradition for what it is, and that involves as well showing the limitations of that textual tradition. And that is why, for a subject like women, we really felt that it was necessary for us to include some voices that would not be represented in that textual tradition, and that would be the voices of, for instance, reformists, voices of women themselves. We've interviewed people, and those interviews are recorded actually in the book, so that if somebody's teaching about this subject, they're not under the mistaken impression that medieval and medieval influenced textual tradition that persists today is the only Muslim way of looking at these verses, some of which can be complicated. Another way of showing the limitations of our sources was that we decided that we had to look at the Quran on women and every Quranic verse that had to do with women. And in fact, we reached a chapter of 50-something thousand words before we realized that that was more than a chapter and is now becoming its own book. But a small part of that is still included in this volume as a chapter tracing the lexicon on women in the Quran. And that we felt was necessary because what the Quran says on women and what the tradition says about women are two, it turns out, vastly different things in some cases. And so we hoped to include this voice that turns out to be actually what you would have thought would be complementary to the tradition, but in some ways it's an alternative to it. And so I think because we've got actually 4 people commenting and
we don't want to take up too much time.
Yeah, exactly. So go ahead, Firas.
Well, my own thoughts are always those of, cautious and anxious, because people always come and ask you, so what does tafsir say on this and that? As if it's, and you're supposed to provide an answer immediately, and that it's a kind of dictionary approach. And unfortunately, most of the time there are no answers. But I think the learning is in actually figuring out how a very long-lived tradition of commentary on the Quran sustained itself for so long, I think. And is still relevant, but dissonant as well today. I think the dissonance is what is really striking, and whether that dissonance comes from our social architecture, the way that we conceive of society, and how they thought of it, or whether it is between them and the text, is a question that I think we're still exploring. But certainly my own, the little thing that I took away from this project was how incredibly erudite the tafsir tradition is, how you can always learn an immense amount from it. I mean, they put a lot into it, and I think there's a kind of sincerity there, intellectual sincerity that they tried to accomplish. And yet, at the same time, it would never have occurred to them, the idea that women have a voice. But that speaks more to our time, actually, and that's, I think, the great challenge is figuring out what do we do about that? What do we do with a tradition that is so venerable and so erudite and so, full of things to learn, and yet somehow almost irrelevant? And that's where I think we went back necessarily to the Qur'anic narrative itself, and we tried to kind of immerse ourselves in it as much as possible, iteration after iteration, so that you get a sense of being in the narrative, in the text itself. And we could see that it was speaking in a different way. It was above it all somehow. It was somehow above all of the commentarial, concerns. It was above questions of. It seemed to be above questions of gender somehow, even though it spoke about gender, above everything somehow. And it constructs hierarchy in a way that seemed, made sense. Could make sense in its own terms. You could see how hierarchy, a system of hierarchy, made sense. And yet, of course, in our modern context, we think of hierarchy as something we have to think about all the time and perhaps resist and challenge in order to be egalitarian. Not so in the tradition. So that, I think, for me was an interesting journey. But I should stop because we have such eminent guests and we want to hear from them all.
Indeed. So let's see, who did we have going first?
Well,
was it Yasmin?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I think it's on Yasmin to go first, if that's all right with you.
I wanted to thank you for writing this book because it's very, very important for a number of reasons. I haven't prepared the speech that I'm going to read. I'm just going to speak from my heart because I was reading this book for the past, I don't know how many days since you've sent it to me. And not only that it's spanning 12 centuries and includes interviews with contemporary women and Muslim scholars, but also the introduction was amazing, so much material there. The footnotes referencing modern works and leading you to further questions and to other topics that might not be addressed, like, for example, Hur al-Ain, which seems to be very fashionable these days. Also, how the authors have defined woman and man through time. And the selected verses, of course, I mean, not only because they are relevant to Muslim women's lived experience today, but for me personally, because as a Muslim woman, I struggle with some of these, especially the famous or rather infamous 434, and of course 282 about the legal testimony. And also the veil, because the veil somehow seems in modern times to have become the sixth pillar of the faith and took importance previously unknown, especially after the petrodollars were pumped into the Muslim world and so on. I am especially grateful for the new names that you have included in the volume, not only modern, but from different perspectives that, you know, when you work, you don't really, even though I really try to be inclusive, I mostly work on Sunnah and Shia together, but, you know, Abadi, Ismaili, and so on. So that was really, really, I'm grateful for that. Also, the way you allowed me to change my mind, because I have read things by people I thought differently of before. You have highlighted their opinions, like Fadlallah, for example. I only know very little about him, and I've read certain commentaries on women's rights to sexual pleasure or masturbation and stuff like that. So I thought, wow, he's a reformist, and I was really disappointed that he turned out to be a conservative. I especially like the introduction or the forward, not the introduction, the prolegomenon, because of the way you have juxtaposed the three periods, Meccan, early and late, and Medinian, and how this affected the depiction of women and the words used for them, and how you've highlighted certain problems, like, for example, the simplistic notions that, after Medina, there was a break from the tribal and familial ties, but, patriarchy was alive and well throughout. This shift in descriptions was really, really important for me and eye-opening. And it emphasizes that every commentator is actually a product of his time, and that we should never look at a comment without looking at the context. So the introduction about the commentators that you provided, an introduction to their characteristics, their context, their times, their ideologies, their personal interests, like, I don't know whether it's grammar or something else, their creeds, their affiliation to schools of law. It really explains why some of them kind of torture the text to make the text say what they wanted to say, rather than extract from the text and read it the way the text was intended to be read. And how essentially the exegetes were in cahoots with the jurists serving fiqh rather than the text. I mean, this shows up especially in the commentary about the legal women as legal witnesses. How you highlighted every exegete, this one is a storyteller, this one used Israeliyat, and so on, introducing people I had not looked at before. So I'm really grateful for you writing this text, and I can see it as a very important textbook to be used in class. I also appreciated how you navigated the identity politics with state politics, that even though modern times should have been having a modern outlook, how still modern times support laws that are women unfriendly. And even though they don't necessarily base these laws on Quranic commentaries. What I found very interesting also is the idea of how women themselves can internalize patriarchy. What was her name?
You turn on my mic for her so she can hear it. Fariba Al-Asban.
Yes, that. I mean, I was stunned by her defense of, women being, she's torn as a woman. So it was very interesting to read that interview. I was also very pleased to read Ayatollah Sani'i. He has, a lot of redeeming factors in his interview, that sometimes one man is not enough, but you need 4 men. So 2 women is not such a big deal. But I also realized that everyone just keeps saying that, women didn't work. They weren't good with sums. They didn't engage in in trade and so on. And what about Khadija? I mean, she's an example that is ever present, but nobody thinks of her when they just put this into context historically, that, women were at home, they were family oriented, they didn't work. So, this is very apologetically okay, kind of. So it's okay to have her testimony not as valid, but then they turn around and argue it's only in commerce, but not everywhere else. So she can be the only witness in childbirth and stuff like that. So what I found very interesting is the entire apologetics involved in this. So it's really good to read all these things in context and together, one by one, because that in and of itself not only contextualizes the text, but it also contextualizes the exegetical process, how it changes from time to time and from ideology to ideology. And also how many of them rely on what the jurists said, and that there is a consensus about this or that, when the consensus is really very problematic in and of itself, because nobody defined whose consensus it is, how long it is valid, is it for the entire ummah or only the scholars or only the imams or stuff like that. And what strikes me always about ijma' is that in the Quran, the word ijma' in and of itself is always negative. And it is a misguided majority that is trying to shut up an enlightened minority. So the use of ijma' for me is problematic theologically if you consider the Quran. And since this is a Quran commentary, what's a book about Quran commentaries, it struck me that, you know, the ijma' is sometimes mentioned when in the Quran itself it's so problematic. You know, Yusuf's brother had an ijma' to throw him in the well, to sell him. So it's always a very negative context. So also, I found it endearing at times that, you know, as an afterthought, more or less, that some reformists tend to add that, yes, you know, this testimony is so on, but women can be judges, and they can be judges everywhere, whether it's criminal or family or whatever. So I think that, you know, even the modernists are kind of torn between adhering to the heritage of all the previous commentators' outputs and their own modernist views, how to try and reconcile these two different perspectives. So that's why I find this work so very important, in that it offers these perspectives together and one by one, using the texts that, at least for me personally as a Muslim woman, I have issues with and find problematic. And thank you. And of course, the feminist view is important, not only because they are women, but also because they have actually spent a great deal of time engaging with the text, even to the extent of, no, I have to say no to this particular interpretation. So thank you for doing this. I really had great fun reading it, and I learned so much. I appreciate every single footnote and all the work that went behind it. And I can see that it's going to be a very successful teaching aid, and that's my 2 cents.
So much for this wonderful comments. Thank you. That is so lovely to hear, actually, because there are really a lot of footnotes in this volume. Really, a lot. Firas, I don't know, do you have any comments that you wanted to add on to that?
No, I think it was a very generous capturing, really, of all of the good things about the work. But yeah.
I think that the only note that I had was that, you know, you captured a lot of what we were trying to do, because I think that we certainly felt a great sense of responsibility when putting out this work, that actually here it is. This could potentially be the work that's being used to teach about these subjects now for a very long time, and how that then confers on us a sense of duty to to capture some of those various nuanced perspectives. So thank you so much for noticing that that's what we did.
Also, the linguistic play is very important, you know, from Untha to Mu'minat to Munafiqat and so on. This entire section was extremely enlightening, and also the context, you know, between Meccan early and late and Medinian is very eye-opening. I mean, really great work.
Thank you so much. Shall we move on to our second speaker, which is Anna Chrysostemides? Yes, go ahead.
Hi, well, I definitely want to say thank you as well for putting this together, because I'm mostly going to be talking about teaching. And this is the most incredible teaching tool that I think I've ever come across. Karen's been telling me she's been working on this for years, and I've been telling her that I can't wait for it to come out for years, and now it's here. So I'm not even sure where to start. I'm going to speak from the heart too, like Yasmin. It's so difficult to get students who are early on in their university career to really, no matter what their background, to separate their own interpretation of an early text, and such an important text like the Quran, from the historical perspective. And this is something that, yeah? Am I too quiet? A perennial problem, sorry. So what I was saying, for everyone online who didn't hear any of that, is that I'm mostly going to be talking about teaching, and I'm super grateful to Karen and Firas for putting this together. It is an issue that comes through time and time again when teaching Islamic history in a history department, or Islamic studies at a Near Eastern institute, or theology in a theology department. You're always running into the issue of someone reading the Quran and thinking that whatever they're thinking about it is definitely what someone in Abbasid Baghdad thought about it, and that's going to be the same thing as what someone in Ottoman Jerusalem thought about it, right? Which is, of course, incredibly different. And the diversity of interpretations that you have provided throughout this work is really going to make that job a lot easier. I already use Karen's work to teach about human creation. So in Women and Gender, Medieval Islam, it's the class that I teach, we go through and look at the different interpretations and how they're different from the Quranic text itself, and the things that are added and the things that stay the same. And this gives students an understanding of interpretive changes through time and place. And that is exactly what this book will do in so many different directions. And one of the beauty of this thing in itself is that the first half is basically a brilliant secondary source that you can assign students in classes, just to give them a background on the Quranic lexicon on women. Like, that's perfect. It's accessible. It's something that an undergraduate can understand, but a master's student would also feel really happy to read and wouldn't feel patronized by. And it's just so important to give them that background, of course. But also, this can be used in all of those different faculties that I spoke about. I think you can use human creation in a basic general Islamic history survey, right, or history of the Near East. This is something you can use to tie into themes about the different monotheistic traditions, to tie into themes about just gender in general. And you can do that in a survey course without necessarily having to push it to the side in a course about women and gender specifically. And the sections on Mary and marital roles and the veil are things that would be useful for, again, something involving Christian-Muslim relations in terms of Mary, and comparing it with things like the Proto-Evangelion. You can also use these in higher level classes on things like gender, looking at what different people have thought about women through time and why they've particularly thought those things, and contextualizing the text itself. This is just it's going to be such a useful work. I'm sorry, I know I keep saying that over and over again, but this is like a dream come true from teaching, from a teaching perspective.
Well, I'm taking notes from you, I'm kind of realizing how much I can use this myself. So
we're like, can we just put it on the shelf now? But actually, we're going to take it off the shelf.
Are you less tired of it now that you... But it also would be really useful in a modern-day theological context when you're teaching, because you have the interviews, because you have interpreters from the 20th century, 21st century. You've got Amina Wadud in here, which is amazing and perfect. You know, you can combine this with the video clip of her praying, of leading prayer, and then also having students read the entirety of sort of history leading up to her doing that in any of these sections that you've got in here. It's just incredible. So it really is a trip through time and a trip through space and a trip through different people's views, and it's such an incredible educational tool for the undergraduate who may turn up at university thinking that their opinion is the only way forward. And of course, that's what it's for. It's for broadening people's minds. So thank you both so much.
Thank you so much for saying such nice things. I have to say that I forgot to mention that we actually have recorded the interviews. We did 2 interviews that we've recorded of Sadia Sheikh and Amina Wadud, and those will be they're in the process of being edited, and they'll be on the web. And we'll have a page for the book, and so that anybody could actually excerpt clips from them in their classrooms as well. And so it's another way of getting across some of that material. So thank you for mentioning that. Okay, well, so the next person would be Waleed. Are you ready?
I am actually. Hello, everyone. Actually, I will be reading my remarks. I always find it much easier to do that. So, first of all, I'm truly honored to be here and truly honored to take part in the launch of the 2nd volume of the anthology. And I do mean it to be here, although it's virtual. The IAS has always been an intellectual home for me, and I sorely miss being there. Now, Karen and Firas have managed to produce a brilliant 2nd volume, a volume that not only a translator knows how much, only a translator knows how much work it requires. Translation, like editing manuscripts, looks easy after the fact, only because the product is precisely made to produced to make our lives easier. The messiness of handwriting, of variants, of many copies to compare are all smoothed out for us to read leisurely. I would argue that translation is even harder. My late colleague here at U of T, Professor Michael Marmoura, not only a great scholar, but one of the best translators of Arabic philosophical texts, used to say this: you do not understand a text till you translate it. And I actually do believe him. Now, tafsir studies have been revolutionized in the past 20 years. What used to be a marginal field has become a central field in Islamic studies. This anthology is thus part of a new wave of studies on tafsir that has made it both accessible and comprehensible. The contribution of this anthology is, however, more than a mere translation of texts. I will argue that the very selection of the text and their presentation is a scholarly argument of how we study tafsir. There are several reasons for the new acquired status of tafsir studies in Islamic studies. Not least is the centrality of the Quran in modern Muslim religious landscape. Now, two major events in the 19th century contributed to the Quran becoming far more central than it used to be in the classical period. First, the demise of the classical Sharia and its role as an operative legal system meant that the Quran took a more central role in Muslim identity formation. But a more radical shift has been the demise of classical theology, which meant that theological discourse ceased to be built on traditional kalam practices or principles. No one now is truly concerned with sifat or jawhar or tasawwur and tasdiq, etc. This absence of classical theology meant that theology is being done by Muslims nowadays in a new register. This new register is what I've termed scriptural theology, a radical return to the Quran to use it as a guide to define things Islamic. The question that we always hear, what does the Quran say about something, is a profoundly modern question. What this question reflects is the newfound centrality of the Quran as the bearer of Islamic identity. It's thus with this new development in mind that tafsir has moved into central concern both for nowadays Muslims and for scholarly investigation. We needed a more complete picture of the development of the genre, a more detailed studies of the mechanics of the hermeneutical processes, an understanding of how this literature was being consumed and disseminated. The Institute of Ismaili Studies and its Quran unit has been at the forefront of the scholarly engagement with tafsir. Its monograph series and its anthology has become a signature volumes in the field. And I do say this envyingly. Did you hear me, Omar? I want now to turn to the significance of the anthology and why it represents a landmark in the field. First, institutional support for translation is not easy to secure, and translations have a precarious position in academic promotion, and usually are carried out after tenure, if at all. Then translations have also a difficulty getting printed. These two institutional barriers have a more restraining effect on translating tafsir than any other Islamic field. So I think tafsir is peculiarly disadvantaged by these problems than any other Islamic field. Tafsir works are also voluminous, we all know that, and translating any of the classical major Quran commentaries have always faltered after a volume or two. We all know the attempt at Tabari's translation, right? 1 volume and 2, and then it stops. Choosing one tafsir risks distorting the picture of the genre. Now, the issue was seemingly resolved by Helmut Gatsche in his German translation of Selections, which, by the way, was heavily Kashaf-centered, right? And the work appeared in 71, and then it was translated in English in 76. Now, this anthology is not only what used to be was not only outdated, but it was a translation from a translation when it comes to the English. Now, I'd really like to pay a real compliment to Karen and Firas and remind everyone that tafsir translations have, however, an old pedigree in our field. Not least the bilingual translation of Surah 12 as interpreted by Baidawi, which was translated by Beeston and published by Oxford in 1962. In that sense, the current anthology has answered to a major lacuna in the field: the need for a scholarly anthology that represents the genre, that reflects its richness and avoids the pitfalls of previous attempts. So, and the emphasis here is really on scholarly, and already mention has been made of the footnotes, of the preliminary material. I mean, the contextualization, this really makes it a landmark event. Now, the anthology, by coming out, and I'm speaking about the anthology as a whole series, as coming out in thematic volumes, have solved a major problem, that of representation of the genre. Because really, whenever you want to present tafsir, you really have to solve that issue. It's a deeply rich, diverse tradition. So how do you offer it representation? So a thematic anthology is by its very nature far more diverse than choosing a select verses or surahs or section in the Quran. Roaming in the Quran is essential to reflect the richness of the genre. The anthology is also decidedly not Sunni-centric, and as such reflects the scholarly development in our field. We have a selection that is unique and unprecedented, really, in its richness of the diversity of the Islamic tradition. Now, if the first volume was about God, understandably, the second is about women necessarily. For all the debates about Muslim identity, women have come to play a central role in modernity. So central that it has shifted the very hierarchy of the significant things. And that's what I meant the rise of a new theology, really. This anthology offers us one of the richest material from the tafsir genre ever on the topic of women. The material is both rich and diverse, and more importantly, is not only from the classical period, but includes material from living commentators. This is a statement on the genre by the editors and the translators on how to study tafsir and what constitutes the canon. I'm particularly impressed with the inclusion of Muslim voices from non-Muslim countries. The presence of material from North America in this anthology is, to me, a remarkable statement. We can discuss that later on in the discussion. Finally, the presence of translated interviews make clear that tafsir is not only a textual tradition, but it has always been a living tradition, and this anthology makes this not only clear, but sanctifies its inclusion in the traditional scholarly approaches. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Walid. I'd step in to thank him here. I think you're absolutely right. The issue of translation is both underappreciated and probably, I mean, obviously for all the wrong reasons. I mean, I wouldn't know how people would expect to know a text without actually doing that act of translation, especially if they're working with a second language, of that act of translation in their head anyway. I think our field has a particular kind of political dynamic that is overlooked in that sense. I wouldn't imagine that any of the scholars in the classics not knowing their texts inside out. I mean, Greek texts, Latin texts. I mean, I know from my teachers that they spoke of them as if they knew them by heart, and yet people study Quran and tafsir and they know nothing by heart about it. Unfortunately, in our field, so there is that dangerous dynamic there, but also the task of translation, Walid, is also a tricky one because it's alive, it's a living process, and so one of the challenges I think that we had was to stop ourselves from constant revision and revising our translations, because that naturally happens. You know, you do kind of find yourself agreeing on a set number of principles, but then you read something and say, that doesn't sound right, I'm going to change it. But if you change that, you're going to have to change another 500 pages. So
Which we sometimes did.
Which we sometimes did.
I have to say.
So, but anyway, I'm happy to hand over to... No, I'm just conscious of time. Just, thank you very much, Walid, for your thoughts. I think we'll hand over to Sarah.
Yes. Thank you. Am I loud enough?
I can hear you.
You can hear me? Well, I really enjoyed the comments from the other participants, and I don't want to take too much time, but just maybe a few points. I'm speaking as somebody who was involved in the original project and starting in about, I want to say the year 2000, maybe 2001, as a student at Harvard, working under Bill Graham and under Roy Mutahida. And I remember being in the room when we were sitting this long kind of table, and in came the folks from the IIS, and we were sitting there, a bunch of us students. We were PhD students, and we'd been chosen to try and do this funny project, and we'd only been told that our job was going to be to choose some verses in the Quran, and then to go find tafsir and translate those tafsir on that. And thus began 2 years of really a lot of wandering in the wilderness, which I was grateful to have a project that was so interesting at that point. You know, as a graduate student, you're looking for something meaningful to do. And for me, it was my first foray into translation. And I can't say it was hugely successful, but I can say I learned a lot about the Quran. And that I went on then here, and I think I'm at the ISMC because of that experience, in fact, if I really put my mind to putting all the pieces together and why we end up where we do. So it was my first introduction really to intense, I had taken studies in the classes in the Quran, of course, but it was my first attempt at translation. It was also my first introduction to the IIS, and then through the IIS to the ISMC. And now I teach the history of the Quran, you know, as one of my courses. So I'm also thrilled to see this book. And just as one point as a teacher is, for example, I always teach, you know, we teach about the history of the Quranic text. That's the class that I teach. So very much a book history course, of which the Quran is a terribly important book, you know, in world history. So that's my approach to the class. And I'm trying to get students to understand the issue of polemic and how a text speaks and who it's speaking to and its audience, and to really imaginatively enter into that kind of discursive space is incredibly challenging. And I was particularly excited after years of teaching this course to find the discussion on the burial of girl children, or girl babies. And because the discussion of the daughters of Allah, you know, alongside that discussion, I thought really brought out extremely well the way in which so many issues that people, I think, and students in particular, miss, you know, what's really being said, that there's theological points, often points about gender. And so in that particular verse, I've had students cited, and I think really miss the point, you know, that's being made in the Quran. I've tried to emphasize it myself in different ways, but never with anything like the clarity that's in this book. So is just, I think, going to be a really helpful teaching aid. And the introductory material and also, I would say, the appendix, are terribly erudite, and they're not joking. I mean, there's a lot of footnotes here. And if you want to know, for example, how Nodika differed from Nikolai Sinai, in terms of the sequence of the order of the revelation, you'll find it. And you'll find much more beyond. And all of that is really terribly important, because I think when we teach or when we read as scholars, part of what we're doing is trying to understand what's being said. And to do that with the Quran is just fundamentally challenging, because it's not a text that's arranged from, linearly. So that act of thinking of it as a book is just at its very core challenging. And I think this book brings this out brilliantly. So how the Quran works, I think you've learned a lot, from all of this material. As a translator, so I've done translation afterwards, which was actually published, or translations. So I can also say that the act of translating, particularly early works, is so challenging, and the fact of wanting to I translated a book that also has the term fadl, as occurs in one of the verses here, 434, or the root, and I spent years trying to understand how my author, Ibn Qutayba, who was he? Who's the guy today that I could look at and say, well, that's like him, and because you want to capture the voice, and it's so challenging. I finally came up with someone who will remain anonymous, but he was a cultural conservative and someone I didn't really particularly like. But you need to have sort of a person in your head when you're translating, and that act of imagination you guys have done over and over and over again with some people that you probably didn't actually like very much. As you were trying to sympathetically, empathetically understand what they're saying, why they're saying it, and in as neutral and as kind of a neutrally possible way as to give a sense, because you are the intermediary between that person's view of a text that also is complicated and the present. And you're the only one who can speak for them. And that's it's a privilege, I think, as a translator. It's also an incredible challenge. So I have to say, I read particularly closely, the chapter on 434, and there was some really challenging stuff in there. And, to be able to translate what in today amounts to, some of the discussions are basically dealing with marital rape, and you've translated in a way that I think gives access without being specifically judgmental. You also, I think, brilliantly include Ayatollah Sani, who you've already mentioned, who is just, provides such a good voice, I think, for another view of some of the more difficult parts of that verse. So I think it's quite that was something I'm sure we never thought about, back to 20 years ago, of how to approach, the text and the translation. It never, when we were sent off as students to go find, various tafsir, it never would have occurred to me to go find people, and interview them. So it's hugely important, I think, in terms of offering a balance, to the way we understand the text. So no, that's that. Just another maybe final set of points. In reading this, there's a lot of my thinking about what is a book, going back to the class I teach, going back to the books themselves. For students and for, I would say, this book provides state-of-the-art, literature review on each of the scholars that are included within the tradition. And reading the footnotes, reading the text, you really can, I think, get a very good understanding of what scholars now understand to be the position, for example, of Muqatil or Tabari, etc. You also, I think, get a good sense of how fragmented the tradition is, how the idea of a book itself is rather challenging, and why this might affect how you can work with the tradition, the tafsir tradition. So, for example, the comments that you made on Al-Qumi and his treatment of Abul Jarud, you referred to as a corpus. And I think that term, rather than necessarily a specific book in a specific time period that you could put your fingers on, is really important, because we don't have, for example, all of the text, as it may have existed at one point. And over and over and over again in the comments, you deal with that problem. You don't leave it, which I think is important to understand that the tradition itself was multivocal within even what we think of as one person and one book. So that multivocality within even each work comes through very nicely.
In the longer term, I just have sort of a wish list, if I may. I've said all the wonderful things that we can take from this, from my point of view. My participation in the Library of Arabic Literature, I think, showed me that there's so many different projects working in translation, and that there's a lot of reinventing of the wheel, in the sense that many of us sit down with words like fuddle, and you've got a brilliant, description and discussion of the whole terminology. But we do it fresh each time. There's just a lot of inefficiency. And to the extent that any part of this book can be made open access, I think would be hugely helpful to the field. By which it doesn't have to be the printed book, in a PDF that's made freely available, but being able to take out and treat as data, the words and some of the glosses, and being able to, for example, make possible for people to align some of the pieces, the original texts, with the translation, and then to reuse that as data, in informing algorithms that might, learn how to do translation, to allow people to see those alignments, and then students to go on to new texts and see the words in context. All of the technology is now increasingly allowing that kind of work, and by making the translations and their alignments available. So all that really means is we need machine-readable files, of texts, so not PDFs. But if we only have PDFs, we can, of course, OCR them too. So, so just to say that I think there's a lot of interesting work that can be done on the back of, the work that's being done here at the IIS. And that I know the Kitab Project would be very keen to be involved in, and so if we can help in any way, just let us know. My phone, no, okay. But thank you so much. I feel so fortunate, to have seen this come this far, 20 years, and I can see there's many years ahead, so thank you.
You go. Well, thank you. I just feel so crushed by all the generous comments that from all of you. I mean, Walid, Anna, Yasmin, and Walid, and Anna, and Sarah. But I'm just happy that it has a reception, because these kinds of projects, as I think our colleagues said before, are really not. They're not looked upon as prestigious scholastic enterprises, because they involve, just translating, putting things next to each other, or so it seems, of course, they're kind of cutting and pasting, but, it's such a monumentous effort. So, Dr. Daftari, that's why it took so long. But it's out now, so. But also figuring out, with anything that's worth its salt, it's figuring out how to be creative again, and bearing in mind the possible, readership. Who are we doing this for? We're doing it for students, of course, like you both said. We're doing it for our peer group of scholars within the field who might want to read it, we hope. We're doing it to represent a tradition, like we said, that we may not be comfortable with, but which is necessary. We're doing it also as inevitably some kind of explanation of the Quran. As you said, some people's access is only through this material. So there's lots of different things to think about. And then, of course, the added pressure, no pressure, of such a topic that I think, as we said in an earlier interview about this volume, that there is potential for a kind of intellectual delinquency, which we were very concerned with, because it's very easy then just to extract this material and I think, as you noted in the 434, and just put it there on a page and leave it. That could easily be done, but of course, so again, we had to think creatively about, okay, well, what really can we do? And so we ended up looking at the Quranic discourse itself, and there you go. It produced a whole parallel world almost. Yeah.
Absolutely. And in addition to what Firas has been saying, I think that the point about empathy that you brought up, it's something that we've actually discussed at length in terms of how to translate, how to get yourself back into the world, to understand why it made sense to them. How on earth could they think that was fair? How on earth could they think of themselves as a just and upright person and be saying something that we think of as pretty much scandalous, yeah, as horrendous, right? As like morally absolutely abhorrent, right? And so it's that act of empathy that you have to undertake when you go back and you think, well, what was their perspective on this? How could they have been saying that? And then you remove yourself from that's the translation part, and then you remove yourself, and then you try to write a little mini introduction that explains that to the reader. And it's just, it's very, it can be really difficult. But then that act of empathy, I think that all the practice that we've ever done with the act of empathy for the works of tafsir, I think is coming more to fruition on the work with the Quran. I think because actually that's also a text that takes a great empathy to understand and to go inside of the worldview, like you pointed out with the buried infant child. And actually, I myself didn't understand that verse truly until we looked at it, until we were able to find the scholarly framework to analyze it and look at it through that light. And then suddenly I saw, oh, well, it's obviously a part of the response to the pagans. Like, that's what it's doing. It's criticizing those pagans for burying their... And suddenly it all clicked into place. But it is that act of empathy where you really, it's somehow leaving the self behind and being able to enter that entirely different world, like absolutely fully, that is sometimes challenging, but also, also really rewarding, I think, in this process. So I wanted to point that out. And I don't know, maybe we should open the floor.
I think it's only fair that we do, so.
Yeah.
Before that, I have to apologize because I did make a great mistake. I forgot to introduce the editors of the volume. So that's my line manager reminded me when I sat down.
They know us now. They know us now. It's fine.
So a couple of things. But before that, just see how interesting this was. Okay, we heard about a new sixth pillar of Islam. We heard about people torturing texts. We heard about bad ijma. We heard about dreams come true, on the positive side. We heard about an intellectual home. Thank you for that. We heard about scandalous views and sympathizing with them. We heard about intellectual delinquency. That's pretty nasty. We heard about a fragmented tradition. So, I mean, my comments are endless here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, and thank you for the panelists for sharing your kind words, and thank you for not saying what you really thought about the project. No. Now, one thing I have to say, Karen Bauer has been a senior research associate at the IIS for a long time. She is the author of Gender Hierarchy in the Quran, Medieval Interpretations, Modern Responses, in which, like she said, she's looking in her monograph at all of these interpretations and doing all of these analyses. So quite a good companion to the text themselves. Although she continues to be interested in working with Firas on producing almost companion volumes to these projects. So these projects seem to be kind of mushrooming other projects. She is also the editor of Aims, Methods and Contexts of Quranic Exegesis. But she has a whole range of interests so she is an absolute fantastic anchor and one of the foremost experts in Quranic exegesis that we have, but she also combines this with an interest in the history of emotions in the early Islamic period, which is not at all a subject that people have been interested in. And I think she is going to open up a lot of avenues which are interesting for research. And she's obviously also interested in gender in Islamic intellectual history and thought. And she continues to contribute to all of these diverse fields, which is quite remarkable if you think about it. Firas, on the other hand, well,
No, on the other hand, that says it all.
see, translators have to say, do we say however? Do we say however? On the other hand, but, anyway.
Nevertheless,
Firas has an interesting side to him, which is the promotion of scholarship and also the scholar who has. I don't want to say betrayed. No. No, the scholar who has also become a leading administrator of scholarship. So he is the head of the School of Humanities, Social Sciences, and Health.
I do what I can.
Yeah, you see? I mean, can you really combine all of this? Anyway, at the University of Wollongong in Dubai, which is an Australian university in Dubai, where he's also associate professor of international studies. So he combines international studies with the interest in tafsir. He has translated a whole tafsir. He has translated the tafsir of the two Jalals, of the Jalalain, of the two Jalals. I forget the name now, but anyway, that's irrelevant. And that is found online as well as in text. Mahalli and Suyuti, yes. Jalaluddin al-Mahalli and his student Jalaluddin as-Suyuti. Therefore, the tafsir is the tafsir of the two Jalals, Jalalain. And he has translated that is found on text, and that is also found online in the website of the altafsir.com, which is patronized by the Alul Bayt Foundation of Jordan. And so when he translated the tafsir of the Jalalain, he has also translated the Quran, because it's a paraphrastic tafsir. So you are translating at multiple levels of complexity. And by the way, I always look at your translation, so thank you for the contribution. Now, Firas, there are things that link Karen and Firas. One of them is Princeton. So Karen studied at Princeton, and her PhD from Princeton. And Firas spent some time in the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. And the second element that links both somehow is Patricia Crone. They were both students of Patricia Crone, or associates of Patricia Crone. In Firas's case, maybe more of a, ghulam of Patricia Crone. But so she was also my teacher, my lecturer, and so they have a good pedigree. This is one of the toughest pedigrees. Karen also studied with Michael Cook. How much more pedigree do you want? Firas spent 5 years in the IIS. Believe it or not, and he taught in the Quran course in Jippish in our graduate program for Islamic Studies and Humanities. He was one of the people who ended up editing the final products of the translations that Sarah mentioned, and other contributors also produced, and so Firas came in with other colleagues, Sajjad Rizvi and later on Farhana Meyer, to produce this volume. Since then, we have considered Firas as he is actually de facto the editor of the series, of the sub-series. So Firas will be involved, I'm sorry to say, you will continue to be involved in this project with subsequent volumes. Yes, he went on to the American University in Dubai, so we lost him, but we didn't lose his scholarship. Okay, so I'm glad to say that. And so now, before we move into the questions, we'll take questions from the audience here and also online. But just to make a very serious remark, that we didn't pay any money to our contributors for their kind words beyond what we thought it was reasonable. That's a joke as well. Okay, so now we open the floor for questions. So we have a question over here. If you can identify yourself and stand up maybe and wait for the mic. Yes, there's some roaming mic.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful day to celebrate such a wonderful book. Thank you very much. And I have my personal, intellectual, as well as educational reasons to say thank you to Karen, to Firas, to panelists here, as well as online. Because I work on education, and mostly on education in Afghanistan. And I have a PhD student as well, who is, I think, is online as well, who's working on the female teachers' experiences under the Taliban too. And I think the book is a timely needed contribution to the body of knowledge and to the voiceless women around the world, but particularly those in Afghanistan. Anyhow, moving forward from this point, the way I see the position of Muslim women in Muslim society particularly, but maybe it's also the case among other societies, as I see them mostly like as a kind of a constant culture and border crossers. And I have a few reasons for that as well. And unfortunately, sometimes certain political situations try to push this social entity that you have described across the border back. So this constant kind of culture crosser and the border crossers, of course, is very troubling for many women, especially those in Afghanistan right now. And the thing that I would like to perhaps put as a kind of a discussion for panelists here or online is that when we look at the position of women, and Quran gives them a new kind of cultural context and a new social context. Now, in order to give them, this woman, a tool to enable them intellectually, as well as to give them intellectual tool beyond being social entities, what kind of agency women can look into the Quran. And I'm really, really very much interested into that. And I'm so happy that you have included interviews of women, and that's, I think, sometimes one narrative tells more than 100 of facts and figures. Thank you very much.
That's a very good question about social agency.
Go on. You go. No, please go on.
Well, Karen will just, I guess, complement and supplement the response. But I think it's a very important question, the question of agency and how you define agency and what we're here for. In a purely materialistic context, where there is no aspiration, nor even possible conceptualization of what life after death means, or hereafter, which is very much the case in modernity. I mean, the sensibilities of modernity are such that the afterlife is just a kind of painting on the wall. In the Quran, it is a constant. It is so poignant that it defines all kinds of agencies. And so the agency that you find pursued, as understood by the Quran, is one about spiritual realization and spiritual growth. But that agency is compromised or tested, if you like, by the social agency. It's the other way around.
Yeah.
It's social inagency, perhaps, this incapacity to become a social agent is it's a challenge. Specifically on the topic of women. That's how I understand it.
Yeah. So I think that so that's okay. So to just go into the details of that a little bit more. So in the social scene of late antiquity, there were certain people who had more rights than others, right? So there was the paterfamilias, who is a familiar figure from antiquity, and then in late antiquity continued on as this familiar figure, which is the male head of household, who was responsible for all manner of dependents, okay? Women were only some of those dependents, right? The term orphans in the Quran seems like it could even potentially mean adult women, or potentially people of both sex who might not have had other protectors, right? So there's this figure in the Quran of somebody who is constantly being addressed because he's got a lot of social power, okay? And if you're the one who has the social power, you're often the addressee, right? Because you are the one who has the power to enact all kinds of things. So they're told, for instance, oh, marry off the single people among you, right? And who's that going to marry off all these single people among, right? So what kind of social power would you have to have in order to be instructed in that way? We're talking about a society that's very different from our modes of society and our understanding of agency. And so within that society of people who had agency and who had less agency, right? There's never any attempt to give women absolute social agency exactly the same as men, because that just was not the society, and that just isn't the way that things worked. But what is so fascinating then is the absolute moral agency that women have in that context, and that slaves have, and that everybody has. So that, in fact, if you're doing good deeds, and there's where you get into this question of fadl, because, like, actually, which means, how did we translate it?
I think you said merit. You also talked about the economics.
So in a sense, it's that you can have a kind of distinction of one person over another in terms of, like, wealth. Some prophets have this over others. You have some people are more wealthy than others. You have all these kinds of, but actually in the afterlife, it's only somebody's good deeds which result. There's an overturning of those hierarchies potentially by the good deeds that you do in the world. And so that's what's actually really striking about women's agency, is that there is this, I don't know if I just went on a bit too long.
No, I think it's striking about the Quran that it addresses those who need to be addressed for the thing to be done.
Yes, that's it.
Which is the transformation, the social transformation on a moral level. I mean, slaves are never addressed, but women are sort of, they're there.
And they are addressed sometimes.
They are addressed.
Certainly.
So there are levels. There's a kind of nuance there. But I think your question is really, what you need to think about is whether you're trying to figure out a modern concept, reading it back into the text, or trying to understand the Quran in its own terms and then let that reflect on your own thoughts for contemporary times. But it's a very important,
That's precisely it. It's that going back into its own times can sometimes, then you think, oh, okay, well, that's why it was like that. That's why that address is like that.
Okay, I'm told we have 365 three questions.
Actually, we've now got
one
5
online,
questions.
Yeah? Question from participant online.
That's correct, yeah. We've got a question from Georgina Jardim, who is from the Centre of Muslim and Christian Studies in the United Kingdom. Georgina asks, on what basis were Quran texts and their tafsir selected for this anthology, i.e., prominence of a text in feminist debate, for example, Quran 434, or popular discussion, for example, the issue of veiling, or on interfaith relations, for example, the verse on Mary?
Georgina, thank you so much for that question. And hello out there. And hello, Mom and Dad. I forgot to give a shout out to my parents who are out there somewhere in Seattle. Okay, but that's just, alongside Georgina. So that's a great question. And I think that we did try to choose verses precisely for their modern relevance in several cases. That was exactly the reason that we chose some of them, because of the prominence in feminist debates, for instance. Because if they're prominent in feminist debates, then they are prominent for a reason. A lot of women want to talk about them. And so why should we ignore them and not talk about them? We need to go right in there and talk about them too. And it's a kind of opening up of that tradition that say has been described in many feminist works, but may not have always been like translated word for word in those works, where you can really, it's laid bare now, you can really see it. And then there were a couple of verses that were chosen because it would have been just deeply unfair to not give any nod whatsoever to the equality aspect of the Quran. But that was very difficult to capture, because of course, even if the Quran says that it gives an equality to men and women, that it's just not reflected in the tafsir. And that, I don't know if you want to say something about that.
I think you're right. I think we try to balance the usually juristic approach to the topic in the tafsir tradition. So I don't think they felt any pressure to try to kind of discuss, the ontological equality, if you like.
No.
They were more concerned to kind of expound on the jurisprudential implications, sticking to the law, and so in that sense, yeah.
And so we, for instance, we got some feedback at some point from from a scholar that said, why didn't you include 3335, which is which mentions believing men, believing women, Muslim men, Muslim women, fasting men, fasting women, praying men, praying women, and it says that they'll all be given a reward. Okay, so why didn't you? So actually we did. We just put it as an appendix to the introduction. We included a few of the interpretations just to show how very little these interpreters actually noted, that it just wasn't on their, it wasn't something that they were interested in discussing, that sort of the equality aspect. So it's there. That person who asked me to include it, if you're out there, you may know who you are, but it's there, but it actually shows up the interpretive tradition for exactly what it is, yeah, which is very interesting too. So yeah.
Thank you. We come back to the room. Dariush. Mike, please.
Thank you. Look, I have to thank you, Karen and Faraz. This is way beyond what I expected it to be, not just because I heard the panelists, but because I had a look at the book. So 2 questions, one for you guys and one for Walid out there. I was absolutely delighted to run into a few extracts of Al-Muayyad Fatina Shirazi's Majalis Al-Muayyadiyya, which brings me to the question is that I would categorize that text basically as an esoteric text, because it is addressed to the members of the da'wah, because it is replete with all kinds of ta'wili stuff rather than what is usually referred to as classical tafsir or commentary. What I would really have wanted to see, I mean, maybe you've put that somewhere in the comments, is that there is an interplay here between tafsir and ta'wil here, which is in the Ismaili genre of it. There is not really any kind of a separation between tafsir and ta'wil, because ta'wil is tafsir and tafsir is ta'wil. They are, because it doesn't thrive in that kind of context that it operates in other contexts. Maybe you could shed a little bit more light on that. And to Walid, there were 2 phrases that you used which immediately set a spark to my mind. You talked about the demise of classical Sharia and the demise of classical theology. What I was really intrigued is to find out how you're connecting those 2 terms or ideas to the current volume, because I find it absolutely motivating to see that somebody is thinking along these lines, that nobody in classic theology is today talking about Johar, Zat and Sifat and things like that, which it's absolutely gratifying to me. But what I really would like to know is how you connect those 2 themes or terms to this volume. Thank you.
So regarding the ta'wil, I mean, we have to keep in mind, of course, which you know, I know that you know this, but just for those in the audience who are students and who don't know this, but that's a term that the meaning of which changed through time. So, of course, Tabari's volume of tafsir, we call it Tafsir Tabari these days, but actually it's called Jami' al-Bayan fi ta'wil ayat al-Qur'an. So he actually used that term to mean interpretation, just the way that we would use the term tafsir these days. Okay, and so precisely in those early periods, I'm not sure if the terminology has been well documented as changing through time. And then as for the question of the esoteric sort of interpretations and the interplay with the exoteric, what you would say, interpretations, I mean, I think Firas has actually written on that. It's actually a very complex distinction. I mean, we made an effort. We wanted to include things that were not in the traditional, what you would call genre of tafsir, and so of course we included some Ismaili works and then the interviews in the modern period, right? So that to counterbalance. And in all of those cases, it turned out that the interpretations that were not within the strict textual genre were radically different. And so it really calls into question the way that we look at one specific type of text and we say, well, that's what Muslims thought about the interpretation of these verses, because actually that's in no way what Muslims thought about the interpretation of those verses. That is what a certain scholarly class of people writing in a certain genre of text thought about, wanted to portray about the interpretation of those verses in that genre, right? Whereas they might have written also outside of it and written something else that is not necessarily different but complementary to what they wrote there. And so, yeah, in terms of including, though, esoteric interpretation, I mean, that is, I mean, I just think that it's not done often enough when we're looking at what is the interpretation of the Quran. People can tend to, and I don't mean to malign any of our colleagues with this, but it's very tempting because to just look in one specific genre of text and see what's there, and without even making an attempt to go outside of it. That's where actually Sarah's project is going to be wonderful, the Kitab project, because of the digitization of so many texts. And so I am very excited about when we can incorporate the searching Quran, Quran phrases, because then suddenly what is tafsir, or what is the interpretation of the Quran, we'll get an entirely different view of that. I can almost guarantee it by looking well outside of the genre and being able to look at the Quran in a lot of different types of text. So I don't know if that answers your question, and I don't know if Firas has a comment.
Wally can answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
No. Yes. We can.
Thank you. So what I meant really is that, in a sense, I was trying to put the development of the series at the IIS in its historical context, like how tafsir studies have moved and become central in the field, is to me due to a historical development that is really internal to the Muslims, in which the question, what does the Quran say about something, has become the mode of becoming a Muslim. Just to give you an example, before the 1800s, I mean, any questions facing Muslims was either answered through a Sharia-minded approach or a theological-minded approach. And both of these are related to the Quran, but they're not really Quran-centric. The Sharia is a legal system where, many elements come into, and Kalam certainly is not based on, it's a rational discourse, right? So this movement of the Quran into central stage in modern Muslim lives is I think due to these two effects. Hence our interest in tafsir, hence our interest in studying it, because it has become central both to modern day Muslims, but also central to our, we really knew far little about tafsir than other fields, than kalam or than law. And the last 20 years have been catching up. And now we're really at the moment that this anthology, in a sense, embodies. That's why I mentioned those two things. Thank you.
Another question online.
Yeah, I'm going to try and merge two questions, if I may, because they're very, very similar. We have Lutaf Danedina, who's asked, while this book will be very useful to teachers and students involved in the study of the Quran, will it be of any benefit to non-academics? And the other question, which is from Keisha Ali from Boston University, she says, I'm curious how the editors would like to see the volume being used by scholars, students and lay people. What would count as success for you?
Keisha,
why did you ask us that question? Go on.
Could she be expelled from the lobby?
That's the problem of not planting questions.
Grateful.
No. Well, so do you want to answer that? Okay, I don't really want to answer it either, but it's okay. So Keisha, I'm so glad to see you out there. I mean, I don't see you, but I'm glad that you're there. Thank you for coming. What would success look like to us? I mean, I think that the question of whether this is a book that would be of interest to absolutely anyone, the answer is possibly not. The introductory materials probably would be, but some of the translations are very technical. But I mean, whether it could be of interest to lay people who who actually want a scholarly approach to these texts, then absolutely yes. Because I think that a lot of what you can read online, I mean, we just discovered yet another book on women in the Quran. Again, today, Firas was saying, but have you seen this one? And I mean, there are many different takes on certain subjects, and often that will be presented with particular viewpoints. And we also, of course, have our viewpoint, and that is pretty obvious, I think, in the introduction and of the book, and in the mini intros that we tried to write. But actually what we've really, really attempted to do is enable a reader to access this for themselves, so that if somebody is telling them this is what the tradition says, or this is why the tradition says this, you know, there is actually the potential for them to look back in it for themselves and say, well, hang on, this is what it says, and you know, and now I know I can read it for myself. So I don't know if that is the answer to your question, but go ahead, Firas.
I think I would be satisfied if it were used in the ways that Anna was suggesting.
Yeah.
I mean, just as a pedagogical tool, I think that would be, you know, it would be really, I'd be happy with that. But I think it's very difficult to answer that question, because these exercises are nourishing exercises. So, I mean, one just feels grateful to have been involved. I mean, I hope that we've done a good job of just being faithful to the textual tradition, really. But it does, we do try in this volume to raise questions about the field, epistemological questions, in the relationship between studying the commentarial tradition and studying the Quran. There are these, unfortunately, these wide gaps in the field. You could do Quranic studies that never look at the tafsir, which is bizarre to me. I mean, and vice versa. So I think we want to just raise these kinds of questions after the class is done.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I apologize. We had allowed some more questions, but we have to close the event. Thank you so much to all the panelists. Congratulations to the editors of the volume. And may I now call Noshin Sharif to close the event. Thank you. You can continue the conversations next door for those of you who are present, and thank you for those who were connecting online. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar, and thank you very much to all our speakers for a wonderfully insightful and thought-provoking event. Please join me in giving them another round of applause. Just a couple of thank yous, if I may. Thank you very much to the events team, Mafe, Chilla, Joseph, and Anna for their thorough organisation, to Sushil and Rahana. Sushil's been running around, as you can see, with the mic, and Rahana's been sort of behind the scenes taking photos. So thank you so much to you guys. And also thank you to our volunteers. You'll meet them at the reception. They will be serving drinks and a few light snacks after this event. Thank you also to everyone who has attended in person and online. I'm sure there are lots of ways that you guys would be spending your Monday evening. So it's great for us that you've spent your Monday with us. So thank you very, very much. Before we conclude, there are a couple of dates for your diary on forthcoming events. From Monday the 6th to Thursday the 9th of December, we have an online conference titled Fatimid Cosmopolitan: History, Material Culture, Politics and Religion, which is purely online and will be convened by Dr. Gregory Bellotto. So that's one event that you guys should be made aware of. The other event that we have is on Thursday the 16th of December, where we have a lecture which will form part of the Islamic History and Thought lecture series organised by Firas Gilon from the IS, and that will be given by Dr. George Warner, titled Pilgrimages of the Heart, Remote, Ziyara and the Articulation of Interiority in Twelver Shi Devotion. Bit of a handful there. More information on these events can be found online on the Institute's website, www.iis.ac.uk. Thank you once again, and please feel free to join us in the atrium for some light refreshments. Thank you.